Lesson 8, Alexander Graham Bell. Today's vocabulary. Deaf, partially or completely lacking the sense of hearing. Invention, machine, tool, or other device that someone has made, designed, or thought of for the first time. Inventive, skilled at inventing or creating something new, ingenious. Mechanics, the study of forces in motion and how they work in the world. Receiver, the part of a telephone located in the earpiece that converts electrical signals into sounds. Transmitter, the part of the telephone that converts sound waves from the human voice into electrical impulses and sends or transmits them. Telegraph, a device that allows a person to send messages over a wire by tapping out coded letters and words. Alexander Graham Bell. About 3 weeks after the children's school concert, their first snowfall occurred. Several inches of glistening snow lay like a soft blanket upon the ground. It was a perfect start to the holiday season. It was also the first day of winter, and Samuel was busy preparing for his annual open house event. This was Samuel's way of welcoming in the forthcoming holidays. He always invited his family, friends, and neighbors to a wonderful evening of festivities. Both he and Jack liked to cook, and Amy and Ethan enjoyed helping them. Jack also entertained the guests by playing the piano. The children had arrived bright and early, eager to help out in the kitchen. Jack was already there when they appeared. He was sitting at the kitchen table drinking his morning coffee and eating buttered toast. Alfie was sitting next to him, hoping to receive a tasty treat. "Granddad, can we make cupcakes?" asked Amy. Before Samuel could reply, the telephone rang. "That's the 4th time this morning," exclaimed Samuel. "I sometimes wish Alexander had invented something other than the telephone." "Who's Alexander?" asked Ethan. "Is he a friend of yours?" Jack laughed out loud. "We're old, but we're not that old," he announced. "Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876 during the late 19th century. "I knew that," said Amy proudly. "In fact, I know a lot about Alexander Graham Bell because my reading group just wrote a report about him and read it to the class. So, can we make cupcakes?" "Sure you can. And when you're done with that, I would like you guys to make a batch of cookies," announced Samuel. "I really like the chocolate chip cookies you made last year," said Jack. Amy and Ethan got to work. They placed flour, baking powder, butter, eggs, oil, sugar, and chocolate and vanilla frosting on the counter top and began to prepare the batter. "Alexander Graham Bell was Scottish," continued Amy. "Both his father and his grandfather were speech experts and worked with the deaf. His mother taught piano, but she began to lose her hearing. We learned from our research project that from a very early age, the science of sound was an important topic of conversation in Alexander's home. Alexander Graham Bell's father invented a sound alphabet called visible speech. This alphabet was used by deaf people. It is difficult for some deaf people to learn how to speak because they cannot hear spoken words. Visible speech was a series of pictures to show combinations of sounds from the alphabet. The pictures were designed to show the person how to shape their mouth to make the certain sounds." "Babies learn language by imitating others," chimed in Ethan. "But humans are kind of unique because they can make all kinds of sounds like laughter. Sound comes out through the mouth because when we breathe in and out, air travels through the larynx in the throat. The air makes the vocal cords vibrate, which creates sound. Then certain parts of the mouth and throat help to shape the sounds into words. I had to take a test on this last semester," said a confident Ethan. "Well, what a pair of smarty pants you both are," yelled Jack, and then he chortled to himself. "Amy, are you done teaching us all about Alexander?" "As a matter of fact, I'm not," said Amy, who was not entirely sure she liked being interrupted by her brother. "Because of his father's work, Alexander decided that when he grew up, he wanted to work with deaf people too. Alexander used his father's visible speech to help deaf children learn to speak more clearly. We also discovered that when Alexander was a boy, he and his brothers were very inventive and created many interesting new things. When Alexander Graham Bell was older, he continued to study science, and in particular, sound. So he was kind of like a scientist, too. You are quite the expert, said Jack enthusiastically. Did you also learn in your research that Mr. Bell was not only a scientist, but also a musician? When he was a young man, he played and taught the piano. Later in his work life, he combined these interests. He spent time studying the mechanics of the piano and of tuning forks. He was particularly interested in how vibrations make sound. Yep, said Amy, who was now holding a large mixing bowl while Ethan used a small handheld electric whisk to create the light and fluffy batter. At the sound of the electric whisk, Alfie began to bark loudly. The children laughed, but Samuel told Alfie to pipe down. However, continued Amy over the suppressing barking sounds that Alfie was now making, we also found out that Alexander Graham Bell began his career in London, working at a school for deaf children. He had private students, too, whom he taught in his home, which was how he met his wife, Mabel Hubbard. She was deaf, but had learned how to speak. Mr. Bell helped her to speak more clearly. I hope your group got an A on that report, said Samuel, who had been busy preparing his specialty, chicken parmesan. Hey, Jack, as soon as I'm finished here, you can get us started on that beef stroganoff you've been threatening to cook for us. My beef stroganoff is famous, replied Jack indignantly. You should be honored that I have agreed to even make it. At that moment, the telephone rang again, and Samuel shuffled off to answer it. As Amy and Ethan dropped tablespoons of cupcake batter into paper baking cups, Jack proclaimed, Well, before you get an A from me, did your report explain how a device that we know very well today, the telephone, came to be invented all those years ago? Yes, replied Amy as she carefully placed the tray of cupcakes inside the oven. That was the main part of our report. In the 1830s, a man named Samuel Morse invented the telegraph. It used different combinations of dots and dashes to tap out messages. His system is called Morse code. Telegraph, telephone, television, telecommunicate. Why do all these words begin with tele? Asked Ethan curiously. Good question, yelled Jack while Samuel hovered around him, hoping that he would not cause too much of a mess in his kitchen. Tele means far away. So that is the root meaning of the first part of all of those words. Phone means sound, and graph means writing, explained Jack. So telephone means far away sound, and telegraph means far away writing, said Ethan enthusiastically. Vision means something you can see. So television means far away image, continued Amy. You hit the nail on the head, pronounced Samuel. The telegraph made it possible for written forms of communication to travel on wires across great distances, continued Amy. The only problem was that only one message could be transmitted at a time. Alexander Graham Bell believed that it was possible to invent a kind of telegraph that could transmit many messages at the same time along the same wire. His wife's father, Mr. Hubbard, believed in him and helped to finance his experiments. Did you also learn about Mr. Watson? Inquired Jack. Yep, we learned that Thomas Watson built the models of Mr. Bell's inventive ideas, and together they figured out how to solve problems and improve the designs. Eventually, Alexander believed that instead of a telegraph, it might be possible to build a talking machine. He had studied how air changes as sound waves or vibrations move through it. This led him to wonder whether sound waves could change an electric current. If so, spoken words could be sent over a wire. Mr. Bell knew that he was getting closer and closer. He stopped teaching so he could devote more time to his invention. Then, on March 10th, 1876, during one of their experiments with a transmitter and a receiver, Mr. Bell and Mr. Watson made their first breakthrough when sound was transmitted and received. Finally, after improving the design of their talking machine, the telephone was invented when, on March 10, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell spoke to Mr. Watson on their talking machine. At that very moment, the telephone rang. "That's either Alexander Graham Bell or Mr. Watson," said Jack loudly. All four laughed out loud as Samuel shuffled off to answer the telephone one more time. Samuel shook his head and smiled as he made his way back to his grandchildren and his old and dear friend Jack. "The invention of the telephone more than 100 years ago has forever changed the way we communicate with others," exclaimed Samuel. "I, for one, am grateful to Mr. Bell's inventive nature and his understanding of the mechanics of sound." As the day progressed, Samuel, Jack, Amy, and Ethan baked and cooked up a feast. They continued to talk and laugh and enjoy each other's company. Samuel's home was soon filled with wonderful aromas. As the afternoon turned into evening and the sun began to set, family members, friends, and neighbors began to appear. They arrived with smiling faces, eager to spend time with each other and to celebrate the coming holidays. The children moved through the crowd, offering the guests various home-cooked foods. Samuel had made a wonderful log fire that burned brightly. The light from the fire cast a warm golden glow. Amy sank into a comfortable chair by the fire. Her mind was filled with thoughts of Samuel Morse and his telegraph and how his invention inspired Alexander Graham Bell to invent the telephone. She thought about the future and began to imagine the possibilities. Amy smiled drowsily and wondered if maybe one day she would work on an invention that would change people's lives. As the evening wore on, Jack played a number of beautiful medleys on the piano. Afterwards, the two good friends sat together by the fire and gave thanks for the blessings of another year spent with family and friends.